Probably the most telling moment in their speech was when they said humans are rational, because that really symbolized the entirety of their case, which was filled with as many assumptions as a neoclassical economic model. We are going to prove two things in this debate. First, we're going to prove that this has a horrible chilling effect on society and is incredibly bad for minorities and the disadvantaged, despite all the assertions and fiat that they tried to pull, because we're going to give structural reasons why this is going to be the case. Second, we're going to show how this externalizes, or rather internalizes and individualizes societal level problems, shifting blame from systems of oppression to the individual. So, first, what was their model? They said that this thing would be constantly updated, that data would be released, that everything would be perfectly transparent. We say, no, that is not the case. First, let's just look at what their fiat actually gives them the right to do. They can say that the model can be implemented, but they cannot provide, but they cannot just assert that it is going to work perfectly that would defeat the point of the debate. So, what are some structural reasons that this model is going to be highly imperfect? First of all, corporate lobbying power and the influence in the way that legislation is set, and the influence of corporations over the media that then distorts the way that the public views the social credit system. What this means is that corporations and NGOs, which we have already seen in the info slide, can give people scores and can probably influence the system in some way, even if it's just the structural power that they have in the status quo. That means that because of their increased access to lawmakers and increased access to the halls of power, therefore means that they are better able to set the agenda of the social credit system in terming good behaviors as the behaviors that they view to be good, or the behaviors that benefit them. What this means is that it is likely to be structurally oppressive. It is likely to reinforce the bigotry we see currently. It is likely to be racist in any possible way because of that reflecting structural power. But even if you don't buy our mechanisms around lobbying, even if you say okay, we can design the system well, you cannot ever fiat the way in which people interact with the system. Because insofar as anyone in the Western liberal democracy that this is implemented in has intrinsic bias, implicit bias against whatever group, be it minorities, be it the poor, for whatever reason, that is going to show up in the way that they interact with the social credit system, because on average, people as a result of these biases are going to give less social credit to the poor. They are going to give less social credit to minorities and the less well-off, because these are the groups that have lesser ability to do these sort of good things like go out and volunteer, and crucially, they have less ability to be seen doing good things, because when you are poor, when you are less well-off, you often have to spend your time caring for yourself. You often have to spend your time going to your family. You cannot engage in the sort of conspicuous volunteering that is often the hallmark of the upper middle class that means that you are seen as a virtuous person. As a result, this is horribly oppressive, and their assertions do not stand. But even if we aren't thinking about minorities and the disadvantaged, who are the most important group because of how vulnerable they are and how oppressive this could be, even if you look at everyone in society, this makes their lives far, far worse. Because even though they said, oh, people are just perfectly rational, they're going to do whatever is best for them, first, this is empirically not the case. People are not rational. They do things like altruism. They do things like being irrationally selfish or being risk-averse. What that means is that the way in which they interact with their system is going to be through a prism of risk aversion, is going to be a prism of thinking in every single social interaction that they go to. How is this going to affect my credit rating? How is this going to affect my wait time at the airport? Is my life going to be negatively affected by what I say next in this conversation and how it will be perceived? At the end of the day, what is going to happen is society is going to become a game of smoke and mirrors. It is going to become a game about what people feel about you and how people perceive everyone else, and the social credit system therefore becomes a way in which people can take out their grudges against other people, can make their implicit biases into reality by negatively affecting other people. They said that data would be released on this, but even if data is released, note that you cannot release what individuals have rated other people in the social credit system, because if you were to do that, the system would become completely toothless. No one would ever rate anyone else negatively for fear of negative repercussions from those people in their later lives, and as a result, there would be no point to the system and it wouldn't incentivize any sort of behavior at all. The final thing to note here is that NGOs and companies can actually affect people's social credit, and because they're a lot larger, I think it's safe to assume that they can probably affect people's credit a lot more. The reason this is incredibly problematic is that, first of all, when you look at NGOs and when you look at companies, they'll often have particular views of what is good and what is bad. A company might view certain things like certain things oriented more around like a individualistic framework of living as being good. An NGO may orient itself in terms of like what its mission is, doing things that help that mission as good. An NGO may see certain other things that do not help its mission as being bad, and what you get is the ability of individual groups, private groups, to coerce other members of the public into like conforming with their way of life. There is no real reason that this like method of coercion is legitimate, because it's fundamentally arbitrary, is fundamentally dependent on the initial power of these groups. Go. Yes, we think that is bad on some level insofar as groups with power are able to enforce their norms on groups without power. In general, we think that is a bad thing. We think that is how systemic oppression materializes in a lot of cases. So now let's talk about how this individualizes societal level problems. Let's look at the example of pollution. So when you take a look at the Gilets in France, you see that they are lashing out against a system that tries to pin the blame on climate change on them rather than the large companies that have actually caused it. This is a problem that is exacerbated massively by a social credit system, because now everything is seen as a problem of the individual, because individuals are now like held accountable through the government for every single tiny decision that they make in their lives. What happens at the end of this is that individuals are seen as the root cause of the problem, rather than the government or large corporations or powerful interest groups in society being seen as the cause of the problems. It deflects blame away from the powerful, gives them incentive to use their existing power for lobbying purposes, like I mentioned earlier, to influence the system, and as a result, this system should never be implemented.
Opening opposition starts by wasting about 3.5 minutes on stuff that was already rebutted by Shanshan's setup, because what she said was, we'll have an incredibly transparent system where you can see what is happening to what, which corporations are enacting which sort of things, but also all of their material about corporate lobbying, for instance, did not recognize the fact that our, thing was that these metrics are not set by a legislature, so if you're paying off politicians, you do not have any effect on this. It was set by independent experts to whom you cannot make these certain donations or things like that, and so in that case, all of that stuff about corporate lobbying and stuff simply became null. Our mechanism was one of independent review, where we consulted a broad number of people from all over society, where you include people from every single part of society in this decision-making process, so to the extent that it might discriminate against poor people, we still have an incredible number of poor people in the room, but also Shajan's explicit mechanism was the amount of, it's not just simply how much good you do, it's about how much it costs you as well. The donations that a poor person makes to charity are counted for way more than the donations, than the same donation of a rich person to charity, simply because it recognizes the sacrifice that individual people make, and it recognizes the relative agency of people, because the ethicalness of an action is not just proportional to the size of the effect, as a consequentialist may claim, it is proportional to the amount that you sacrifice for it, and that is what does it. But also we had another check check, which was the appeals mechanism, which they also didn't respond to, but also the fact that we have, for instance, computer systems or analysts to detect where there are racial or class or gender biases, and then we would rapidly act to correct those. They did not respond to any of the regulatory stuff. This debate is about if a social credit system is good or not. They do not have fiat to simply say that we don't have fiat. Moving on to the actual debate, two issues, then one bit of substantive. First of all, what's more fair? Second of all, what's better for people? Third of all, is a substantive contribution about how this will lead to further political change. So, what is more fair? We have the very simple claim that many people in society are good people who are not rewarded for being good, and a great number of people are complete dickheads who are never made to feel the bite of what they bring to other people. And we think these good people simply deserve to reward because they sacrifice themselves, because they benefited others. And often simply being an ethical person and doing good things is such a thankless thing in life, and it is good to simply have it recognized, and they simply deserve to live a better life because they've contributed to other people. And note that this is also just like the premise of the capitalist society in which we live. If you do something good for other people, you receive money in exchange for that, simply because that is the way that we recognize value. But similarly, bad people can cop it. They simply deserve to pay for this. If you're the motherfucker who treats your barista like shit, maybe you deserve to just be put through the airport metal detector 7 times just because you're a piece of shit. And that is the thing that we address on site opening opposition. Some people cause damage, they deserve to pay for that damage. Some people cause great harm to themselves in order to lift up others in their life, and they deserve to be rewarded for that. Opening opposition has 2 responses. The first is that people simply act out grudges. I think this is the vast minority of cases. But also, if there is someone in the world who really hates you, I don't know, maybe you deserve it, or something like that. The second thing that they have is they talk about how this reductively individualizes societal problems. First of all, I think our mechanism about selecting the particular criteria get around this, and it's likely that if you have a large number of regular people in a room, they will recognize what things are simply forced upon people by external agencies and force them to act in a way that is bad, and so they're likely to choose far more reasonable criteria than simply punishing people for what they're shoehorned into doing. Second of all, I don't know, what is it that corporations do that force you to be evil? It was just never clarified. They talked about the Gilets jaunes, but never gave any actual examples. Some people are just bad and deserve to be punished. Third of all, I think what likely happens is it retracts blame to those who do it. This will come up later in my substantive. But if you are the one who is made to be punished for doing things that damage others, and then you see corporations getting away with mass-scale pollution and underpaying of workers, you're far more likely to say these people deserve to be punished for causing harm to others, and you're far more likely to campaign for the internalization of negative externalities. So that issue actually falls to us. So, what is better for people? We said more people will be ethical now. They were just oh, this is really reductive. Look, just listen to Shan Shan's speech. First of all, we said you simply get a direct incentive and deterrent model. They're oh, well, not everyone's economic. Look, a lot of people want to be nice. A lot of people want to be good and want to lift up the society around them. But it's so hard to be nice. You have bad days. Sometimes you just want to be a piece of shit. Sometimes you just want to look after yourself because it's really hard to do that. And so you need this encouragement. But second of all, it puts a price on certain actions. It's really easy to see being nice to people as something that's completely worthless, as littering, as something that's of no value. But if the government puts a concrete value on that, it is far more likely that you will act in an ethical way because you attach a substantial amount of value to it rather than seeing it as being entirely worthless. Third of all is broader cultural change. It shifts from this sort of consumerist nihilism where you only look after yourself, and it applies to broader efforts. And what this does is it partially replies to CEO's stuff about how this removes altruism. There's 3 responses to this. The third is related to the third subpoint I just said. Firstly, I think people still recognize that it still exists. Your friends aren't just around you because they're there trying to get faster lines through airport security. I think this was maybe a little exaggerated. Second of all, not everything is police. Simply being nice to someone, you're likely to not spend all of your days racing your friends or stuff like that. There is still going to be opportunities for genuine altruism where people can signal that to each other, and that harm falls to null. But third of all is just I think we can just easily impact this out of the debate, which is simply people donating more to charity, people being nice to each other, people just not being dickheads to each other in public, and people not littering and breaking social mores just is a benefit that probably outweighs these very slight perceptual harms to relationships that are likely to happen on either side. So, what does this look like? The benefits that happen in the info slide: more volunteering, more partaking in your local community, more simply being a good person to each other, but also it applies to more things that are outside the scope of the topic, because people are more likely to simply attach value to ethical actions, and so they're more likely to be ethical. Why is this better? One, people do good things, so that benefits others. But second of all, people being good actually benefits themselves. You feel like you're contributing to society. You feel like you're being a good person. Close.
Being forced to be altruistic isn't a cultural change. It's something that makes you feel forced, it's something that infringes on individual. It makes every individual in each interactions feel worse as an individual human.
I think the first thing is this simply isn't coercive. You're simply being made to pay for doing damage. You're being rewarded for doing good things. That is Yes, being made to pay for things. It's not like entering a shop is coercive or something like that, but also the government is allowed to police morality in every other way. If you break a law, you are coerced into going to prison or stuff like that. Look, the government is able to police morality, it should be encouraged to do so. Last of all, how this leads to further political change. We say a culture of taxing immorality and rewarding altruism generalizes to other areas in society. That is one, because you can apply the principle to other cases. If you feel you're personally being cheated, you can look at a company and say, well, why are they allowed to get by on this? But second of all, people likely feel cheated when they are held to a different standard than other organizations or governments. So what it looks like is people being more supportive of things like carbon taxes, aggressive regulation of pollution, or violations of labor law, because there is a bigger culture of internalizing externalities. Of course, we won't single-handedly accomplish this, but we think what we do is we provide the rhetorical force, we provide the precedent, and we provide the popular will to implement them, and it's a small step towards really big impact policies, so this actually does have quite a large purchase in the debate. At the end of the day, a lot of people want to be nice, and they should be encouraged to do that, they deserve to be rewarded for that, but if people are shitheads, they can cop it.
Panel, I'm going to do three broad things in this debate. Number one, I'm going to look at the meta debate in terms of how the system is likely to be implemented in the real world. Second, I'm going to talk about incentives for good behavior. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the social harms of this particular policy. First clash, how is this system likely to be implemented? I just want to clarify, panel, that yes, Gov has the fiat to implement the system in a liberal democracy, but they cannot fiat the manner in which this system is going to be implemented. They cannot fiat that this system is going to be implemented in the fairest manner possible, for three reasons. Even in liberal democracies, we see lobbying by rich individuals like the Koch brothers affecting political decisions. Second, we see the sort of political capture by corporations because corporations like ExxonMobil, for the longest time, have donated to the Republican Party in America to stop them from pursuing climate change policies. But thirdly, and I think this is the most damning to the case, even in liberal democracies, we are seeing the rise of right-wing populist leaders who actively disenfranchise minorities. The Five-Star Movement in Italy, the rise of the AfD in Germany, the rise of Trump. And most importantly, the social credit system on their side of the house is also one that's going to be implemented by the same corporations that have a vested interest in insulating themselves from backlash. Theirs is a world, no thank you, where a liberal democracy like France cannot even get any political capital to implement progressive taxation, where African Americans still cannot get enough political capital to implement affirmative action policies. I find it difficult to conceive that this policy of transparency and accountability, which is the mechanism we rely on to wash out Alan's harms, is likely to manifest in the real world. What is the upshot of this argument? The upshot of this clash is that I submit that the social credit system is likely to be controlled and designed by an elite hegemon in positions of power. This means the sort of government safeguards on their side of the house are not only unlikely to exist, but also incredibly tokenistic and unreliable. But even if, so their mechanism in DPM was, but the poor and disenfranchised are not stupid, right? They can voice their discontent. The problem with that is that oftentimes, no thank you, the rural poor, the individuals who are most affected by these policies, such as the poor individual who's not allowed to get a car to go from the rural to urban areas because he really needs to work. These are the sort of individuals that have been shut out from electoral systems. They are often the sort of, they are often so disenfranchised that they don't go to the ballot box to vote. They find it hard to lobby against rich corporations because they don't have the money to do so. The upshot of this is that I think they cannot fiat that the system is likely to be implemented in a fair manner, and that is why I think, in terms of the plausibility metric of this debate, no thank you, I think Alan's harms become far more plausible. But I want to do the second clash, right? Even if this system can be implemented in a good manner, and taking GovBench at their very best, I'm going to show you why we still win on opening opposition. Second clash, on incentivizing good behavior. I have three responses. Firstly, what is the stand from opening opposition? I think we can persuade people to live moral and ethical lives, but we draw the line at imposing punitive sanctions on non-compliant people. The reason is because we think that the conception of ethics is inherently subjective. What do we mean, right? So we're happy for like NGOs to appeal to like your common morality, to appeal to people's basal desires to see themselves as good. We're also happy for like moderate religions to like incentivize people to do good things. So firstly, I think that there is no necessity for their government policy to the extent that they also say that there's already many good people in our society. What was their response then? They said, but good people need to be rewarded. Three responses. Firstly, I think the model that we stand for is one that we want individuals to be rewarded not by an extrinsic reward, by an intrinsic reward. That they are happy because like they have done something moral. Why is this better than the world in which they stand for? Two reasons, right? Number one, because oftentimes in a world in which we live in with limited resources, the state it's impossible for the state to reward every single individual, right? So even in the best case conception of a moral world where every individual is moral and ethical, it's difficult for the state to reward every single individual. It's difficult for the state to give subsidies to every single individual or to cut taxes to every single individual. What therefore is the upshot? The upshot is that even if I get a perfect implementation from God, the benefits to that policy is finite. What is the counterfactual that we stand for? The counterfactual is when we prioritize intrinsic benefits, the benefits are far more infinite, right? Because we will always have that constant political will, that constant incentive to do good, independent of whether there is a reward. And that is why we think it's particularly important. That is the first metric of weighing later. The second metric of weighing is that I think this is bad because I think this leads to a toxic mentality. Why? Because when you only help people who have utility to you, think about it. Who are the people with the least utility to you? The minorities, the poor people who have the least utility to you. When people protest in the streets, when people like from the transport systems within France decide not to go to work, those are the individuals with the least utility to you. Those are the individuals who, like for instance, cause you a lot of inconvenience because you can't take the subway to work, you can't take the bus to work. This means that individuals and people in positions of power and like middle class individuals now have a toxic mentality to the poorest and the minorities. That leads to the sort of schisms that makes it far harder for minorities to get any sort of political change on their side of the house. But the last reason is what Alan tells you. There are a lot of structural reasons why it's difficult for individuals to be ethical. You can't just say, but it's a case-by-case basis. Firstly, because you don't have fiat over that. But second, I think, even in the perfect world where they have a case-by-case basis, it is ultimately super reductivist, right? Because I think by logical extension, you have to stand for the poor not doing anything about pollution because they really need a car anyway. Because without the car, there is no way for them to travel from the rural France to urban France. So I'm not sure like what is the logical extension of that principle, because I think the logical extension of that principle would be to like just divorce the sort of expectations from poor people. Why is that important? And that's why I do it that case-by-case basis, right? Because I think that's going to increase the tension between the rich and the poor. The rich are facing far higher standards than the poor. This means that you reduce the sort of political capital that rich individuals have to help the poor at a point to which you are imposing such a diverse double standard. Or what this means, and this leads me to my third clash, is that you distort social discourse. Before I move on, closing. We draw the line, right? So because I think speeding rules, there's a concrete third-party harm, and I think it's reasonably foreseeable that you can not speed. But we think for a lot of poor individuals, it is difficult for them to not use a car. It's difficult for them to buy environmentally friendly products, like organic products, because it's incredibly expensive. If what you want is a case-by-case basis, what I've just said is that this is bad, right? Because the case-by-case basis imposes double standards that leads the rich to be far more resentful of the poor. That means that it's far harder for you to get the sort of support from middle-class individuals who are most affected by this policy, by the way, to support the sort of causes of poor individuals. But the last reason why you distort social discourse is what Alan tells you, that you shift the focus of key social issues to the individual, right? That corporations now are able to divorce the liability from themselves when they say, you are the one at fault. The individual who drives the car is at fault. And it's not because of the state's inability to do things like make electric cars a lot cheaper. You externalize the backlash from the state and from corporations to the individual. And that is why we think it's so ethically harmful, because the discourse changes to one where we place accountability on states and on corporations to one on individuals. They can't just say it's not mutually exclusive, right? Because I think that this becomes a convenient tool for states and corporations to externalize backlash. Happy to stand in opening opposition.
Speaker, we do not regret societies in which certain cultural norms tell people that there are things that you can do that are right and that are wrong, and that dictate the way that people behave. Take, for example, countries like Japan, where there are strong norms that say you should park your car backwards, that you should put your litter in the bin, that you should contribute to cleaning up your society, that you should obey and respect your elders. These are societies that we would not regret on government bench. But these are societies that are incredibly struggling to exist in the Western liberalised world because of the sense of individualism and selfishness that was well outlined to you by opening government in today's debate. What they wanted to prop to you on opening opposition was a world where people were dictated by an intrinsic sense of moral good, and where they made their decisions based on a moral good that would sort of direct them into doing things like not destroying the planet and not doing concrete third-party harms that they said were a good enough justification for speed cameras, but they gave you no mechanism or even slight hint of where this moral system was likely to come from. Here's a few reasons why it's not likely to exist at all. Firstly, these individuals are brought up in a society where the rewards that they reap are based on the principles of capitalism that is always tilted towards people who are economically advantaged. For example, if you are the person who is always bypassing airplane lines, it's because you have more money and therefore you think you are a more deserving and better person. A second reason why this moral good struggles to exist is because the way that religion is often separated from these societies, and people are often not taught to think of anything other than themselves and basic short-termist desires that they learn as a young person through things like school and university. I think that they have failed to provide a single mechanism to prop up their alternative, and they have also failed to explain why the government bench is harmful in any way whatsoever. I would like to have three main points of expansion in this speech. I'll take you a little bit later. My first main point of extension is that this model is most important to implement because of the way that it enfranchises low SES and oppressed individuals within Western liberalised democracies. So I think there's a few different aspects to this point. Note that all that opening government has been able to provide so far is a sort of way of modelling the idea that we can maybe protect poor people from the ways that the system might be gamed against them. But at closing government, we're going to rise to the challenge that sometimes the system might not always be the easiest to access for these poor people, and we're going to explain that actually it enfranchises their outcomes regardless of if it's done well. So the first thing to say here is, on principle, we believe on our side of the house that rewards you reap in society should not be based on your financial literacy or on your economic standing. That's for 5 main reasons. The first is that this is obviously determined by lottery of birth, and that's ridiculous. We think that all people should have an opportunity to actually earn their standing in society rather than be randomly allocated when they pop out of the womb. Secondly, we think that the education standards that are required to access things like financial literacy that reward you with good credit scores are very, very difficult to obtain in comparison to things like moral standards that you can understand from just knowing what is illegal and what is not. Note that this list wasn't like a code of behavior that you must engage every conversation with. It was a list of things like put your litter in the bin, do not leave cigarette butts on the streets, and things like that. Those were very easy for uneducated people to understand. Thirdly, we think that the resources required to be financially literate and financially rewarded in society are very difficult to gain and often need to be gained at birth. For example, if you take something like credit scores, which is a similar system that they have to prop on their side of the house that obviously continues in both worlds, you need to have things like good savings in the bank, you need to have things like a record of paying your bills on time. Having the resources to do that is not something you are very easily able to get. The fourth reason is that the importance of the starting point in life for a financially based capitalist system is drastically overrated. So it takes years and years and years and years to get away from it, but in a system that is based on moral actions, it takes a couple of months of putting your rubbish in the bin, which is a very accessible action that you can do. The fifth and final thing is that it's principally silly to me that we should continue with a system that lets people skip lines and get faster processing when they don't contribute to the world, where we could easily gear that system to just being contributing to the world and contributing to social issues like, for example, the vast amount of plastic in the ocean, for example, the fact that our planet is dying, and we should reward people for that. So, second point of this part of the extension is that this empowers these low SES people to be rewarded with better access to things like loans, which means that they are better able to break that cycle of disenfranchisement that they currently experience. Because now, as well as having maybe a not so great credit score, they can have an incredible social credit score, which will be taken into account on our side of the house. They can access a subsidized loan. The third benefit here is that rural people are better served in this world, because in Western liberalized democracies, rural people are arbitrarily abandoned by the public systems that governments set up, but they can no longer get away with this when they have social credit scores showing that people who live in city centres are no morally better than people who live in rural areas, and they are then obligated to do things like provide better libraries and better public services, and that is a reward that they should give to those communities. The fourth benefit here is that this is obviously more accessible to people like students and the youth who have to do things like overcome generational wealth. So the current system is geared to like the amount of time you have spent on the planet, because obviously you're better able to have things like a good status in society and a good job and like maybe be able to work in the public service sector if you are an old white dude who's always had everything working for them and has always had some money in the bank. But now those people will be refused access if they have been selfish throughout their entire lives, and you're more likely to reward people who don't ascribe to that way of thinking. I think at the end of this point, this disallows the rich being rich from being synonymous with being a good person, and that was a huge benefit on our side of the house. I'd like to engage with closing.
Okay, so you say on the counterfactually, no source of morality because capitalism is so entrenched or less religion. But on your side, you still need a source of morality by which these experts will find this moral standard. How do you find it? How is that not standard?
Sure. So, like, I think that the thing here is they've got an entire absence of morality from deciding the types of things that we reward people with. On our side of the house, we have a government full of experienced judiciaries, experienced politicians who have been elected by the people, NGOs that have been voted for by the free market, by people who agree with their ethoses and ideologies, deciding certain simple behaviours that people collectively agree, or at least in the majority agree, are for the net good of society. And that's not rocket science to figure out. For example, not taking plastic bags to the shops is something that almost the entire world has clued onto as a good and simple idea that people are able to do. Why shouldn't we reward this? I think that you have a very high burden to take that line of argumentation. Final point of extension is, how does this impact minorities? I think that they don't really explain why the world is any better for minorities, because look, punitive law is likely to discriminate against minorities in both worlds, but law that rewards people is much less likely to discriminate against them. For example, in Black or Indigenous communities where this is community reported on and also reported on by businesses in the area, people who are of the same skin colour or of the same racial identity are likely to report on the good behaviours of their neighbours in a way that is not racist, meaning that those people are able to have better data about them. I think that at the end of this debate, we got huge benefits for enfranchising people within society, and we should absolutely support this motion.
Are we good? See how we're going to win this debate by showing you that this is principally wrong regardless of any of the consequences and always makes people's lives worse, and then specifically why working class people's lives always get worse no matter how the policy is enacted, because all power relations become qualitatively different, qualitatively worse. Explicit response to CG, then the principle, then on domination. CG tell us that this can make minorities' lives better because they can essentially pull themselves up by their bootstraps by getting a really good score and gaming the system in that way. But this misses something crucial, because it is much easier to make someone's life worse with this system than it is to make them better. You can do things like denying a job to a working class person because they have a social credit score, but you're not going to give someone a job even though they don't have a degree, even though they're not qualified for it, just because they have a social credit score, because that's not going to fit into your biases. That's not a way that you can use it. If you do not have the financial capital to put down any deposit on a mortgage, the fact that you have a social credit score isn't going to increase your access to a mortgage. People are still screwed over by all of the same forms of systematic oppression, even if they can get their score up really, really high. So the risk of their score getting really low is really bad to them, but the chance of it getting better doesn't bring them anything at all. The best they can prove are incredibly marginal gains, like being able to skip queues in airports. I don't know, I think if I'm structurally oppressed, I don't really care about that. On the principle, panel, recognize that from the moment you are born, you are completely under the yoke of the state, and it controls your life completely. It controls the type of schooling you get. You have to turn to it when you need health care. It controls where you are buried when you die. And crucially, you can never leave the concept of the state. All you can do is move to a different state. The individual is constantly dominated by the existence of the state. How do we respond to this massive imbalance of power? What we do is we carve out a niche of private interactions in which we live our lives. We tell you, panel, this is fundamentally unjust, this policy, because the government is choosing to actively interfere in this private sphere of interactions. Recognize this is qualitatively different from moral laws, which we get coming out of CG, because this doesn't just nudge your behavior or set a standard that you, can avoid within your private life. It specifically tells you that the private interactions will always be monitored by the state, that your friends will effectively become narcs for the state in telling people when you are not meeting the state's demands of morality. It massively interferes in this one niche that you have from a hugely massively powerful organization. We say that is principally wrong. We say even if it doesn't actually act like this, even if it's quite loosely enforced, the fact that people perceive it to be this way is incredibly harmful to them. It's incredibly harmful to how they view themselves in relation to the state. We say that most of the time you can ignore the huge power imbalance that exists between you and the state by engaging in your private interactions. What this policy does is takes away that ability from the individual to carve out their own niche, to believe that they are not controlled by the state. We say that's massively, principally harmful to them. On domination, because recognize that this is all tied together, because it gets even worse for people who are at the bottom rung of any power relations in their lives. This qualitatively makes them all worse. Specifically for working class people, it is likely that their score will be completely controlled by people who hold power over them, who have some form of power already within the system over them. Recognize this stands even on OG's framing of a good mechanism that is fair to them. It will still be the people who are deciding what score they get will be people like their boss, people like their landlord. Recognize that even if these people don't do bad things to them, the fact that they have the power to do so, the fact that this system exists in principle, qualitatively changes the relationship that exists between working class people and these people who have power with them. Recognize that it's also likely in the way that OG have framed it that if you have a higher score, the things that you do to other people's scores will matter more in a kind of way that the points work. So these people will also have a huge amount of power in that way. What does this mean? This means that when you are engaging with these people, they have a huge amount of power over you and you have no ability to relieve that. It means that when you go into work, you know at all times that your boss can completely monitor you, that not only can they take away your job, they can also destroy so many other aspects of your life. They can make it impossible for you to ever get a job again. They can make it impossible for you to ever be able to gain any kind of a small mortgage. They can make it impossible for you to ever be able to get any kind of economic capital. Recognize that also just in micro-interactions, the point at which your landlord is asking for more rent, you are now afraid to complain to them that you can't pay that in case they tank your credit score. And recognize that this continues to be an imbalance of power, because even though you can do things to their rating, just through sheer marginal analysis, if they already have a high rating, and we think it is likely that they will if they have come into a system of position in power, they've probably done things in their life that have meant that they have been kind to other people and got reciprocal benefits from that. The harm to them of you tanking their rating is incredibly small, but the harm to a working class person of someone really rich tanking their already probably reasonably small rating is huge. So there's a huge imbalance of power in that interaction. What we say is that this qualitatively makes all power relations absolutely worse, because even though they exist under status quo, we say at the point at which that in every single interaction you have absolutely no release mechanism at all. You're completely beholden to this individual. This makes it so much more bad, because under status quo you have release mechanisms that you can use at the point at which it gets horrible. You can do things like protest, you can do things like unionize, you can do even smaller examples, like just being mean to your landlord when you give them the rent, because they're still probably going to keep you in the house, but you can just be a dick to them at the point at which you do that. Recognize that this is completely taken away from those individuals because they perceive the fact that these people have a huge amount of power over them. Even if these people will not tank their rating for doing something like protesting, for doing something like withholding their rent, the fact that these individuals believe that they can stops them from doing it in principle closing, if you have something.
Election processes hold governments responsible to what the public wants. They have a strong interest to serve that public need so that they can be voted in for the next cycle. Why do you think that unions are making public so angry that they'll get a vote for them?
This has nothing to do with what the government does. This is simply a consequence of micro-interactions. This is actually why we beat our opening, because even if the system works absolutely perfectly, just the existence of this relationship makes people's lives indescribably worse. Recognize also at the point at which you do not have many material goods in society, if you are poor, if you are a member of a structurally discriminated against minority, intangible things are much more important to you because you can't really weigh tangible goods in your life because that practically never changes. At the point at which intangible relations become worse, that has a massively negative impact in your life because those are the only things that can possibly give you pleasure at the point at which you will never have access to things like capital. So that should be weighed incredibly highly in this debate because for these actors that's an incredibly huge harm compared to the incredibly marginal harms we've got on GovSide, which are basically just being nice to people and sometimes minorities can skip the queue. What we tell you is that fundamentally all power relations become qualitatively worse regardless of what anyone does. Because even if the system is perfect and people use it incredibly well, the fact that you perceive this increased ability to completely ruin every aspect of your life rather than the single aspect in which they already dominate you massively ruins all of those interactions, massively makes your life completely worse. Panel, it is so clear that CO win this debate. We tell you why the state should not interfere in this way, should not create this system. We said that for the most vulnerable people, the system is infinitely bad regardless of how it is ever enacted, because it always makes every power relation worse. It always ruins their lives. So proud to oppose.
Running a Big Brother principle as your extension is all well and good, but if you ignore the main instrument by which Big Brother gains their power, that is the thing that will lose you this debate. And that's what has lost closing opposition this debate. Because their assumption is, if you have the ability to surveil someone and, control their actions, that necessarily means that you've been oppressed. But the problem was that was happening already. And the problem is that was happening already in an extremely invisible way, where corporate capture had managed to take away the agency of multiple individuals, especially those of a lower class, who had to abide by the way that big corporations forced them to act in order to get a job. In order to get any form of agency, any form of money to move up in the world, they needed to make money and abide by the same selfish values that those corporations had to abide by to get up in the first place. And that's why closing government wins this debate. Because closing government is the only team that gives an incentive for relatively poorer individuals to undertake selfless actions in order to gain income and give an instrument by which they can potentially do so. And that's why we'll win this debate. So let's start by comparing closing opposition's extension, and then we'll talk about opening opposition in this debate. So, firstly, this closing opposition argues that all power relationships necessarily become worse at the point at which this particular thing happens. The first thing that I've obviously pointed out is that these relationships are necessarily bad, but the difference that closing government provides is that you can actually see the thing that is oppressing you. You can actually see your credit score and say that corporations have no right at all to oppress you because you've been that individual who has had a good credit score. You haven't made those selfish actions that deserve punishment. Instead, what this does is it punishes the rich people, especially those people, for example, who work in banks, and all they do is transport capital from one individual to another with relatively little social capital and social productivity, which necessarily means that all that kind of money gets redirected. And the important thing is where they get redirected, because if rich people, for example, want to increase their social capital score, they need to do things like donate to charity. They need to do things like actively benefit the lives of those who live in lower income workers, and that actively helps even the poorest people, even those unemployed people without jobs that live in Western liberal democracies. Those people need to be helped because the amount of money that would go to charities in this instance is extremely high, and that's good in this debate. But even if you don't believe in that mechanism, believe in the stronger mechanism in this debate, believe in a stronger and more important stakeholder in this debate, which is the poorer people who do have jobs but is still underrepresented by the amount of capital they have. That looks like rural people who work on farms and work in the countryside every single day to bring food to the table table of every single one of us privileged individuals here, but never get the requisite income that reflects the amount of money they would necessarily get. But would, obviously, if you ask the average person in the street, how much contribution does someone who works in a farm make as a contribution to you and your life? They would say they're an like most people would say, they're an extremely important person to our lives. We need to give them more of this social credit score. We think they do a lot of benefit to our society. And it's only when you force people and corporations to give this kind of score on a basis of, do you think this action is socially productive versus unproductive, that you can actually and fully appreciate the amount of contribution that these people make to society in a way that capital and money and corporate incentives never actually will. Closing opposition then asked in a point of information, earlier asked in a point of information, well, what is the point of living in a world where all charitable things are done for points? And that is, I guess, the second prong of their extension that they provide at closing opposition. But firstly, our claim is very simple, which is to say that in a world where this is the case, obviously we think that at least having an excuse to contribute to someone in a lower class, who belongs of the lower class, is probably a net benefit under our side, no matter in which way you do it, because the comparative under your side of the house is that no one makes any contributions to those people at all. At the very least, this appeals to an individual's self-interest and says, well, maybe I should donate to charity. And guess what? People who are struggling to put food on the table because of their lack of income don't care that people are donating to them because of selfish interest. They just care that they're necessarily getting that capital. And if you are going to talk about normal people and individuals in general and how they relate to each other, I won't make friends with someone just because it might necessarily give me social points. Obviously, emotions need to play into it as well. They have no mechanism to suggest that the social point system eliminates your emotion and eliminates the very things that make you human and encourage you to have good personal connections with one another. They need a considerably better mechanism for that at WIP. They also then say, this increases the tension between the rich and the poor. But guess what? We like that, because the tension between the rich and the poor is what brings attention to the fact that poor people aren't getting treated properly in modern day society. And the only reason why those tensions aren't public now is because poor people have no agency in order to do so. And guess what? When that social credit system is released and people can see the amount of contribution they make is asymmetric to the amount of income they receive, obviously there's a benefit under our side of the house because the attention is brought there and those things are necessarily able to do. And I think the worst contention and the entire thing rebuttal that this closing bench has to our extension is that the poor people won't be able to necessarily do the kind of actions in order to gain income. But they obviously will. And the point is that they think it's far too hard. There is an increased accessibility. Firstly, in the sense that, for example, working at McDonald's, working in an agricultural place where you don't make much income, working and being good parents to your children are all things that necessarily rise and are able to increase the amount of social capital that is acknowledged for you. And also note the comparative. For example, the fact that there exists a cycle of wealth, that poorer people consistently remain poor if you only rely on money, because only the rich people continue to gain power within corporate structures, whereas poor people never ever do. So at the very least, this offers an incentive for some people to have, socially beneficial actions towards other people. Closing.
Okay, so it's so easy to follow the social credit system. That means that every single poor person will be able to have social mobility, which means that relatively no one has social mobility because there aren't unlimited resources in the world.
Dude, this isn't a case about relativism. We're just going to try to rise the overall capital of every single individual so they can be better acknowledged in a more equal way, proportionate to their contribution to society. I don't care if it's relativist or anything like that. The fact that poor people can be acknowledged more for their contributions they've done to society is a net benefit under our side, regardless of whether rich people get, apparently that benefit is relative or not. All those things mean that those actions are much more likely to be necessarily acknowledged in this debate. So our extension is necessarily important because it shows you the impact on minorities that it has, in order for people, for example, for businesses to be able to see the data that necessarily shows that minorities are doing the kinds of things that, that benefit society, are able to do things like promotions and employ them, because they see that the social credit system is the thing that should define, for example, whether you employ that individual. And that means it's a considerably less arbitrary factor than the one in which it says, you didn't have any networking within my corporation, so you can't get into my company. But there's obviously a much more objective system that exists currently comparative to one exists under our side of the house comparative to one that existed in the status quo. At the end of the government bench, the thing to believe is this: the world right now as it exists is unequal, and it's unequal for the reason that there is no objective metric by which to measure the societal contribution of someone. At the very least, we add a potentially rational metric to allow social contribution to be considered, not just the fact that you had a rich parent.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, and all the lovely people watching on the live stream back home. CEO win this for very simple reasons. First of all, we take the highest burden in this debate at the point at which we accept OG's metric. We say, okay, listen, even if this works absolutely fantastically, even if everyone is judged meritocracy by a meritocracy, even if it is completely perfect, we think, first of all, it is principally illegitimate, and it makes every interaction in your life simply the one with those who have domination and more power over you worse, to the point at which it is not legitimate to enact, and it has harms. Couple of things in this speech. First of all, engaging with opening government, then closing government, then talking about the extension. On to opening government. First of all, on efficacy, I think at the point they way overstate the efficacy of their case, at the point which they don't provide a sufficient mechanism by which it would reach meritocracy. I would note that they give no specific reason beyond an assertion why a panel of experts will be good in any case. I think it's the same issue that falls to closing government, at the point which they say, oh listen, we will have accountable judiciary, we'll have accountable politicians. Recognize that judiciary, politicians and experts, they have gotten to the top of a very racist, very, very patriarchal world. They've gotten to the top because they're not represented, because they're rich. So I think at the point in which you are still being judged from the social norm that have made it the top of an individualistic world, of a rich world, of a patriarchal world, this means that you are just entrenching all these harms. So closing government fall into the pitfall of saying that, listen, we have no stance for morality, which means that our side is less moral. But what they do is they entrench their bad form of morality into a system. So this means fundamentally their system is broken and rotten and based on illegitimate morality. That's them at what they said, but I'm going to take them at their best. 3 outcomes which have been enumerated by opening government, I think they're not good. First of all, at the point at which there is more good behaviour. I think on an individual level, this means that every interaction you have is hollow. At the point at which your friends and members of the public can rate you, this means that every interaction you have is hollow, it has less meaning, and it isn't as important to you. But on the more tangible things which opening and then derivatively closing discuss in terms of having more charitable donations, I think this is incredibly marginal. At the point at which rich people do in fact give millions to charity just because they want their image to be good, just because they want to get better tax, just because they already do this. I think the only way you actually change things is by literally making rich people give all of their income, which I think obviously won't happen because you can't make a system by which the powerful get all their money taken away, because you cannot sustain a system by which the majority does not support. But I think also it just means that you incentivize the poorest people who can't afford to give up things to donate more to charity. I think it also means that probably people are just going to get around the system by donating to charities that aren't that effective, or that support their own interests. See conservative people donating to charities that support conservative social viewpoints. I don't think this is actually a beneficial thing. I think it's mostly just incredibly marginalism. Then secondly, opening governments say, in terms of outcomes, that you foster a cultural change. I gave an POI at the point at which I'm saying, at the point at which this is coercive, why is this fostering good culture, not just fostering a society full of fear where you're being forced in your every interaction? They say, it's not coercive because we're not forcing anyone to do it, we're just setting up a system of deterrence. Panel, that is exactly how every form of coercion by the state currently works. At the point at which your life is being made worse by your decision, we think that is coercive. At the point at which you can lose your job, you can be denied the dole, you can be denied getting a house, I think that is incredibly coercive. They say that, listen, we do this all the time with moral laws at the point at which you convey morality. Listen, the reason why murder is illegal is not because we deem it to be immoral, it's because you infringe the right of others. I think that is where you get legitimate punishment and why coercion is legitimate, at the point at which you are infringing on the rights of others. But this isn't doing that. This is just simply small things in society that are deemed by this patriarchal expert to be good. For example, littering. I think at the point at which you can literally lose your job because you don't like to litter, or because you curse a lot, or because you just act as an individual. This means that that is not legitimate. I think obviously I'm not saying that listen, just small amount of littering will mean you'll be fired. But I think it means at the point at which you are going between you and an almost identical person for a job or for a house, then it'll be given to the other person for illegitimate means. That is fundamentally coercive, that fundamentally changes people's lives. The third thing, which I'm just going to very clearly respond, they say the government will be forced to add more recycling bins and facilitate people. Listen, I think if the government wants to encourage people to recycle more, then they would simply have recycling bins already. I'm not actually sure why the social credit system actually changes incentives. What do we get from closing government? I've already discussed in terms of their opening about why their case about the counterfactual being an immoral society on the north side of the house, first of all, doesn't particularly exist in any comparative way, seeing as they are still operating from the same apparent lack of source morality. But secondly, I think it's fundamentally worse on their side, because if they say that the morality that currently exists in West liberal democracies or the social norms are not good and should not be encouraged, then they entrench them and they systematically force people to abide by them. So I think by their own analysis, they're already failing in this debate. But again, I will take them at their best. Their case on enfranchisement. They say fundamentally that it's incredibly easy to follow and it's very easy for poor people to follow the system. I think this is just fundamentally untrue. I think by the nature of your economic system, you often commit many social mores which are not seen as good and which will be looked down upon. This looks like because you can't afford a car, you're going to be late for work more. This looks like because you don't have the money, you can't tip your waiter, so your waiter gives you a worse result. This means that, for example, because you're not educated, your boss thinks you're doing worse. This is not easy to follow. But listen, even if it is, I'm going to engage them at their best. They say you get a form of social mobility. Two responses to this. First of all, I don't understand how allowing you to skip queues in your to get documents sorted, or to be able to skip lines is actually a form of social mobility. Secondly, even if it is, if everyone is doing it, then there is no functional social mobility because it means that fundamentally no one actually gets a benefit. Opening.
Some people prefer to go over no friends. Do you think they prefer that, or someone reaching out to them, even if it can be construed as someone insincere?
Listen, this would be a really good case, but I don't think they didn't give an analysis as to why you get more friends or why you get more interaction. I would love to have engaged that argument if it was made. Okay, and the last thing that we get from, two more things from closing government. First of all, in response to my POI, they say, listen, this is a mechanism for mobility because we acknowledge the poor people who are doing better things. First of all, I've said why these aren't better things, but listen, I think at the point in which everyone is acting this, then no one gets a comparative benefit. Then fundamentally, they say, listen, we help rural people. I think if the government are smart enough to understand that rural people contribute more to society, then literal liberal democratic governments can also understand that. I think at that point, seeing as they're still not doing anything, I don't know why this would actually force governments into action. On to our case. Fundamentally, we think the principle that the state has incredible ill amounts of power you is legitimate on our side because we have two escapes. First of all, you can live in your private sphere. Second of all, you can vote to decide what the government does. These escapes now are fundamentally out of the world of gov because now you don't have a private sphere because it's dictated what to do, and you cannot dictate what the government does to you because now the government is dictating all of your behavior. But closing government saying response to a domination point, and now we just fuck over the rich. But fundamentally, you can't do that from my previous analysis. I think what happens is you're living in fear of your landlord, your boss. Every interaction in life gets worse. Panel. It's incredibly obvious. Both CEO. Thanks for watching back home.